was a quiet London evening, the sort that seemed settled gently upon the city like a soft grey blanket. A fine mist clung to the windows of 221B Baker Street, diffusing the glow of the gas lamps outside into pale halos. Within, the fire burned low but steady, its amber light dancing lazily across the familiar clutter of our sitting room. I had taken my usual chair beside the hearth, a medical journal resting open upon my lap, though I confess my attention had long since drifted. There is a peculiar stillness that sometimes visits London in the later hours, a stillness that does not feel empty, but rather full of quiet thought. It was in such a moment that I became aware of something unusual, or rather, something absent. The violin. My friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, was seldom without it. In times of contemplation, he would draw from it the most delicate melodies, soft, wandering notes that seemed less like music and more like thoughts given sound. At other times, particularly when a problem vexed him, the instrument would sing with restless energy, but always there was music. Tonight, there was none. I lowered my journal slightly and glanced across the room. Holmes sat in his armchair near the window, long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze fixed upon the darkness beyond the glass. He had not moved for some time. The violin rested in its case beside him, closed. That, in itself, was extraordinary. "Holmes," I said at last, my voice quiet, so as not to disturb the calm too abruptly. "You are uncharacteristically silent this evening." He did not turn at once. For a moment, I thought he might not answer at all. Then, slowly, he inclined his head. "Am I, Watson?" There was the faintest trace of amusement in his tone, though it was subdued, as if even his wit had chosen to soften for the night. "You are," I replied, "and I cannot help to observe it, that your violin has shared in this unusual restraint." At that, his eyes flickered, not toward me, but toward the case at his side. "Yes," he murmured, "it has." The fire gave a gentle crackle. Somewhere in the distance, a carriage rolled faintly along the damp streets. The world outside seemed far removed from the quiet of our room. "I had thought," I continued, "that music was your preferred companion in moments such as these." Holmes leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze returning to the window. "Music, my dear Watson," he said softly, "is often the echo of something unseen, and tonight I find myself listening for an echo that has yet to arrive." I considered this, though I could make little sense of it. "An echo of what?" I asked. Holmes was silent again for a time. When he spoke, his voice was lower still. "A melody." Now I confess, this answer did little to clarify matters. Holmes had, on more than one occasion, allowed his thoughts to wander into the realm of the abstract, particularly when no immediate case occupied his attention. Yet there was something in his tone, something measured and deliberate, that suggested this was no idle fancy. "You speak as though this melody has some significance," I said. "It does." "And yet," I pressed gently, "you have not played it." "No," he replied, "because it is incomplete." The word lingered in the air between us. "Incomplete," I repeated. Holmes turned his head then, and for the first time that evening, his sharp gray eyes met mine. There was a quiet intensity there, not the fierce energy of a man in pursuit, but the calm focus of one who has glimpsed the outline of something just beyond reach. "This afternoon," he began, "a messenger called at the door. You were out at the time, attending to your patient in Kensington, if I recall. That is correct. He brought with him no letter, no card, only a single sheet of music." Holmes gestured toward the small table beside him. I rose from my chair and crossed the room, curiosity now fully awakened. Erisker, resting neatly upon the polished surface, lay a page of handwritten notation. It was, at first glance, unremarkable, ink upon paper, a sequence of notes arranged with careful precision. Yet there was a certain elegance to the hand, and a curious spacing between the bars, as though the composer had paused often in thought. "Do you play, Watson?" Holmes asked quietly. "Only a little," I admitted. "Not with any skill. Enough, perhaps." He rose then and joined me at the table, opening the violin case with a gentle motion. The instrument within caught the firelight, its varnished surface glowing warmly. Holmes lifted it with care, resting it beneath his chin. For a moment he did not move, and then slowly he drew the bow across the strings. The melody that followed was unlike any I had heard him play before. It was soft, almost hesitant at first, yet undeniably deliberate. The notes seemed to unfold one by one, as though revealing themselves rather than being performed. There was a calmness to it, a quiet beauty that settled easily into the room, and yet it stopped. Abruptly, not with resolution, nor with flourish, but simply ceased. Holmes lowered the bow. "You see," he said, "I found myself holding my breath, though I had not realized it." "It ends," I said slowly, without finishing. "Precisely." He returned the violin to its case, though he did not close it this time. "A melody that does not resolve," he continued, "is like a sentence left unfinished. It invites completion. It demands it." "And you believe," I said, "that whoever sent this intends for you to finish it?" Holmes gave a faint smile. "Oh no, Watson." He turned once more toward the darkened window, where the mist pressed softly against the glass. "I believe," he said, "that someone has already tried and failed." The fire flickered. The room seemed quieter still, and though I could not yet explain why, I felt quite distinctly that the silence which had settled upon Baker Street that evening was no ordinary one. It was waiting for something yet to be heard. The hour had grown late, though neither Holmes nor I made any remark upon it. Time, in our rooms at Baker Street, had a peculiar habit of softening its edges, particularly on evenings such as this, when the world beyond our walls seemed distant and thought itself moved at a slower, more deliberate pace. Holmes had resumed his seat by the window, though his posture had altered slightly. Where before there had been stillness, there was now a quiet attentiveness, as though he listened, not for sound, but for the absence of it. I returned to my chair, though I made no attempt to take up my journal again. My mind lingered upon the fragment of melody I had just heard. It was not merely that it had ended abruptly, but that it had done so in a manner that felt intentional. "Holmes," I said after a time, "this messenger who brought the music, did he offer no explanation at all?" "None," Holmes replied. "Surely Mrs. Hudson must have observed something of him." At this, Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Indeed she did, and it is precisely her account that renders the matter interesting." He rose once more, though this time he moved not toward the violin, but toward the mantelpiece. Resting his arm lightly upon it, he regarded the fire as though its embers might assist his recollection. "Mrs. Hudson described the visitor as unremarkable," he said. "A man of average height, modest chest, and quiet demeanor. He spoke politely, though sparingly, and carried himself with the sort of composure that invites little notice." "That seems hardly unusual," I remarked. "On the contrary," Holmes said softly, "it is most unusual." I smiled faintly. "You must forgive me, Holmes, but I fail to see how being unremarkable is, in itself, remarkable." Holmes turned then, his expression thoughtful rather than amused. "My dear Watson," he said, There is a distinction, subtle but significant, between a man who is naturally unremarkable and one who had taken care to appear so. I considered this. You believe, then, that this visitor was disguising himself? Not in the theatrical sense, Holmes replied. There were no false whiskers, no altered gait. Rather, he had achieved something far more delicate. He had removed from himself all features that might linger in the memory. A curious talent, I said. A dangerous one, Holmes corrected gently. The fire crackled again, its warmth steady against the growing chill of the night. And he left no name? I asked. None. No card? No mark upon the paper? Holmes shook his head. The sheet was of good quality, but not distinctive. The ink common, the hand refined, but not unique. Everything about it suggests intention without identity. And yet, I said, glancing toward the table where the music still lay, the melody itself must surely offer some clue. Holmes's eyes followed mine. Yes, he said, it does. He crossed the room and lifted the page once more, holding it delicately between his fingers. Tell me, Watson, he continued, when you listened just now, what did you feel? The question took me somewhat by surprise. I am not certain I can say, I replied after a moment. It was calm, certainly, gentle, and yet there was something beneath it, something unresolved. Holmes nodded. Precisely. It is a melody that resists conclusion. It leads the listener forward, only to withdraw at the moment of completion. Then perhaps, I suggested, it was never meant to be finished. Holmes smiled faintly. An interesting thought, but consider this. Why send it to me? I hesitated. You are known, I said, for your ability to resolve that which others cannot. Just so, Holmes said, and yet I am not a musician by profession. There are those in London far more suited to the completion of a composition than I. Then it is not the music itself that matters, I said slowly. No, Holmes replied. It is what the music represents. He placed the sheet back upon the table with care. A message, Watson, he continued, but not one conveyed through words, through absence. I leaned back slightly in my chair. You believe someone is attempting to communicate with you by means of an incomplete melody. I do. And that this person wishes you to, what? Discover them? Holmes returned to his seat, folding his hands once more. I believe, he said, had they wished me to understand why the melody cannot be completed. The room fell quiet again. Outside, the faint sound of footsteps passed along Baker Street, quickly swallowed by the mist. Somewhere, a clock struck the quarter hour, its tone distant, softened by the night. Holmes, I said after a while, you mentioned that the messenger delivered the sheet this afternoon, and yet you have made no attempt to trace him. Holmes's expression did not change, though there was a subtle shift in his gaze. On the contrary, Watson, he said, I have already begun. This did not surprise me. And what have you discovered? Very little, he admitted, which, in itself, is of some significance. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small notebook, flipping it open with practiced ease. I made a brief inquiry in the immediate vicinity, he continued. No one recalls seeing the man approach or depart. Mrs. Hudson did not hear the door open, only the bell. And yet, when she answered, he was already there. That suggests he arrived very quietly, I said, or that he had been standing there for some time, waiting, perhaps. Holmes closed the notebook. There is, however, one detail that bears consideration, and that is, he carried the sheet of music in a leather folio, plain, well kept, but not new. Hudson noted that he held it with particular care, as one might carry something of value, I said. Or something fragile, Holmes replied, a glance once more toward the table. And yet he left it behind. Yes, Holmes's gaze followed mine, though his expression had grown distant again. Which suggests, he said softly, that its value lies not in its possession, but in its delivery. The fire burned lower now, its glow deepening into a richer, more subdued amber. The shadows in the room lengthened, blending gently into one another. I felt a curious sense of anticipation, not the sharp edge of excitement that often accompanied Holmes's cases, but something quieter, a feeling that we stood at the threshold of a mystery that would reveal itself not through sudden revelation, but through careful, patient observation. "Holmes," I said at last, "what do you intend to do?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned once more toward the window, where the mist had thickened into a soft, unbroken veil. "For now," he said, "we listen." "Listen?" "Yes." "To what?" Holmes's voice was barely above a whisper. "To the silence, Watson." He paused, as though weighing his next words with care, for it is often within silence that the most important notes are hidden. And as I sat there, the quiet of Baker Street settling ever more deeply around us, I could not help but feel that somewhere, beyond the reach of our sight, the unfinished melody awaited its final note, not to be played, but to be understood. It was not until the following morning that Holmes chose to act. The night had passed in a quiet, unlike any I could readily recall. Holmes did not take up his violin, nor did he return to the sheet of music. Instead, he remained by the window for a considerable time, and later retired without comment. I, for my part, slept lightly, the fragment of melody lingering in my thoughts, in a manner both soothing and curious. When I awoke, the light filtering through the curtains was pale and diffused, as though the mist of the previous evening had not yet lifted from London's streets. The city, it seemed, had chosen to remain in a state of gentle suspension. Holmes was already awake. I found him seated at the breakfast table, his long frame composed as ever, a cup of tea untouched at his side. Before him lay the sheet of music, now accompanied by a small magnifying lens, and a notebook in which he had made several precise notations. "Good morning, Watson," he said, without looking up. "Good morning," I replied, taking my seat opposite him. "You appear to have made some progress." "A modest observation or two," he said, and Holmes set down his pen and leaned back slightly. "The paper," he began, "though unremarkable at first glance, bears a watermark, faint but present. It is the mark of a stationer in Covent Garden." "That narrows things somewhat," I said. "Indeed. But more interesting still is the notation itself." He tapped lightly upon the sheet. "The structure of the melody suggests formal training, not merely competence, but refinement. The hand that wrote this is accustomed to composition. A professional musician, then, almost certainly." I considered this as I poured myself a cup of tea. "And the theatre district lies not far from Covent Garden," I said. "Might the composer be connected to one of the orchestras?" Holmes gave a slight nod. "A reasonable supposition." "And one we intend to test?" I asked. Holmes's lips curved faintly. "We do." By the time we stepped out into Baker Street, the morning had settled into a soft, muted gray. The mist lingered still, though it had thinned enough to reveal the outlines of passing carriages and the steady rhythm of London life resuming its course. Our journey toward Covent Garden was undertaken without haste. Holmes walked with his usual measured stride, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze shifting occasionally, not with urgency, but with quiet awareness. There is a certain quality to Holmes's movements when he is engaged in a case of this nature. He does not rush. He observes. He allows the world to present itself, rather than seeking to force its secrets open. It was, I reflected, much like the melody itself, incomplete, yet deliberate. We arrived at the theater shortly before midday. It stood upon a narrow street just off the main thoroughfare, a modest establishment, neither grand nor neglected. Its facade bore the signs of regular use, though there was a certain stillness about it at that hour, as though it rested between performances. Holmes paused briefly before the entrance, his eyes lifting to take in the building as a whole. No posters, he remarked quietly. I followed his gaze. Indeed, the usual advertisements that adorned such places were absent. The display boards stood empty, their surfaces bare. Perhaps they are between engagements, I suggested. Perhaps, Holmes said. He stepped forward and pushed open the door. The interior was dim, lit only by the faint spill of daylight from high windows and the soft glow of a single lamp near the stage. The air carried a mixture of dust and varnish, with the faintest trace of something else, something musical, though no sound was present. We moved quietly down the aisle. The rows of seats stretched before us, empty and undisturbed. The stage, too, stood silent, its curtains partially drawn, revealing a space that felt less abandoned than paused, as though something had been interrupted. Holmes advanced a few steps, his gaze sweeping the room. "Do you notice it, Watson?" he asked softly. I listened. At first, I heard nothing beyond the faint creak of the building settling. Then, gradually, I became aware of it, a stillness, but not the ordinary stillness of an empty place. Rather, the kind that follows sound. "Yes," I said quietly. "It feels as though something has just ended." Holmes inclined his head. "Precisely." A figure emerged from a side door at that moment, a man of middle years, dressed in simple attire, his expression one of mild surprise at our presence. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he asked. Holmes turned toward him with a polite inclination of the head. "Good morning. We were hoping to make a brief inquiry." The man approached, his steps measured. "This theater is not open to the public at present," he said. "Rehearsals have been suspended." "Indeed?" Holmes replied. "Might I ask why?" The man hesitated, though not out of reluctance. Rather, it seemed, from uncertainty as to how best to answer. "There has been a disruption," he said at last. Holmes's expression remained calm. "In what sense?" The man glanced briefly toward the stage. "Our lead violinist," he said, lowering his voice slightly, "has not returned." "Not returned," I repeated. "He left 3 days ago," the man continued, "after the evening rehearsal. He said he had something to attend to, that he would be back the following morning." "And he has not been seen since?" Holmes asked. The man shook his head. "No." Holmes exchanged a brief glance with me. "And his name?" he asked. "Mr. Elias Verne." Holmes's eyes flickered almost imperceptibly. "And his belongings?" he continued. "Still here," the man said. "Everything. His instrument, his music." He paused, as though considering whether to say more. "There is something else," he added. Holmes waited. "A piece he had been working on," the man said. "He would not allow anyone to hear it in full, only fragments. He said it was not yet ready." Holmes's voice was very soft now. "And did he leave it behind?" The man nodded. "Yes, on the stand in the rehearsal room." Holmes turned toward me then, and though his expression had not changed, I recognized the quiet certainty in his gaze. The melody, incomplete, waiting. "Would it be possible," Holmes said, "for us to see this room?" The man hesitated only briefly before nodding. "I suppose there is no harm," he said. "This way." We followed him through a narrow corridor, the sounds of our footsteps softened by the worn carpeting beneath us. The air grew stiller as we moved, the faint scent of varnish giving way to something quieter, paper perhaps, and would. At last, the man paused before a closed door. "This is where he practiced," he said. Holmes inclined his head. The door was opened, and though I could not yet see what lay within, I felt, with a curious certainty, that we stood upon the threshold of something not merely left unfinished, but delivered. The door opened with a soft, almost reluctant creak. For there are rooms, I have often thought, that seem to hold the presence of those who have only just departed, as though their absence had not yet fully settled into the space they once occupied. This was such a room. It was modest in size, yet carefully arranged. A narrow window admitted a pale wash of daylight, softened by the lingering mist outside. A small table stood to one side, bearing a few scattered sheets of paper, a glass half filled with water, and an oil lamp that had long since burned out. Against the far wall rested a wooden chair, its position angled slightly toward a music stand, and upon that stand rested the violin. Holmes did not step forward at once. Instead, he remained just inside the doorway, his gaze moving slowly across the room, taking in each detail with that quiet, methodical attention I had come to know so well. "It has not been disturbed," he said softly. The man who had led us there, whose name, we had learned, was Mr. Calder, the theater's manager, nodded. "No, sir. I gave strict instructions that nothing was to be touched." Holmes inclined his head slightly, though his attention remained fixed upon the arrangement before us. "You have done wisely," he said. He moved then, but with a gentleness that bordered upon reverence, as though he feared that any sudden motion might alter the delicate balance of the scene. I followed at a respectful distance. The violin itself was of fine make, its polished surface catching the faint light in a warm, subdued glow. It rested upon the stand as though it had been placed there with care, neither hastily nor ceremoniously, but simply, deliberately. Holmes regarded it for a moment, then turned his attention to the sheet of music positioned just before it. I felt a quiet sense of recognition stir within me. Even from where I stood, I could see that the notation bore a striking resemblance for fragment delivered to Baker Street. "Holmes," I said, my voice low, "it is the same hand." "Yes," he replied. He did not reach for the sheet immediately. Instead, he bent slightly, examining it where it lay, his eyes tracing the lines of ink with careful precision. "Observe, Watson," he said. "The spacing, the structure." I stepped closer. The melody was there, familiar, yet extended. Where the fragment we had received had ended abruptly, this version continued for several additional bars. Yet it too stopped, not at the same point, but still without resolution. "It goes further," I said, "but it remains unfinished." "Precisely," Holmes replied. He straightened, his expression thoughtful. "Two versions of the same melody," he continued, "both incomplete, each ending at a different point." Mr. Calder shifted slightly behind us. "I do not understand," he said. "If it is unfinished, why write it at all?" Holmes turned his head just enough to acknowledge the question. "Because," he said gently, "the act of writing may itself be part of the design." He moved then to the small table where the scattered papers lay. "These," he said, lifting one, "appear to be earlier drafts." I glanced over his shoulder. The pages were filled with notation, some heavily marked, others left sparse and open. Certain passages had been crossed out, replaced with alternatives that seemed, at least to my untrained eye, only subtly different. "He was refining it," I said. "Yes," Holmes replied, "but not in the usual manner." He selected another sheet and held it beside the first. "Do you see this passage?" he asked. I nodded. "It appears in both versions," I said, "though here it is Altered slightly. Not altered, Holmes said softly. Adjusted. He placed treats back upon the table with care. Each draft moves the melody forward, he continued, yet never to completion. It is as though the composer approached a final resolution and then deliberately stepped away. Mr. Calder frowned slightly. But why would he do such a thing? Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned once more toward the music stand, his gaze settling upon the violin. "May I?" he asked. Mr. Calder hesitated only briefly. Of course. Holmes lifted the instrument with the same quiet care he had shown the previous evening. For a moment, he simply held it, as though acquainting himself with its weight, its balance. Then, slowly, he brought it into position. The first note was soft, gentle. It seemed to settle into the room as naturally as breath. Holmes played the melody as it appeared upon the stand, each note precise, unhurried, allowed to linger just long enough to be fully heard. I felt again that curious sensation from the night before, a calmness, a quiet unfolding, and then it stopped. Holmes lowered the bow. Silence returned, but now it felt different, more pronounced, as though the room itself were aware of what had not been played. "You perceive it?" Holmes asked quietly. "Yes," I said. "It is expectant." Indeed. He replaced the violin upon the stand. "This room," he continued, "has heard this melody many times. Each time, it has been brought to this same point, and no further." Mr. Calder shifted again, unease creeping into his expression. "You make it sound as though the room itself is waiting," he said. Holmes gave a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "In a sense," he said, "it is." He moved toward the window then, his gaze lifting to the pale light beyond. "Tell me, Mr. Calder," he said, "in the days leading up to Miss Fern's departure, did you observe anything unusual in his behavior?" The man considered this. "He was quieter than usual," he said at last, "more withdrawn, but not troubled. For if anything, he seemed focused." "Focused," Holmes repeated. "Yes, as though he were listening for something, even when no one else was speaking." Holmes's eyes flickered slightly. "Listening," he said softly. The word lingered in the air. I glanced once more around the room, the table, the scattered drafts, the violin resting silently upon its stand. Everything was in its place. Nothing disturbed, and yet nothing complete. "Holmes," I said, "if Mr. Verne left of his own accord, why leave all of this behind?" Holmes turned back toward me. "Because," he said, "whatever he sought was not here." He paused, his gaze returning briefly to the unfinished melody, but the path to it was. A quiet settled over us once more, not empty, not still, but filled with something just beyond understanding. "Come, Watson," Holmes said at last. "We have seen enough for now." We stepped back into the corridor, the door closing softly behind us, and as we did, I could not help to feel that we had left something unfinished within that room. Not merely a melody, but a question, one that, like the music itself, seemed to linger, quietly, patiently, awaiting its final note. We did not speak at once upon leaving the theater. Holmes led the way back toward the main street, his pace unhurried, his posture composed as ever. Yet, I had long since learned that such outward calm often concealed the most active workings of his mind. He was not merely walking, he was arranging, comparing, and listening inwardly to the quiet pattern that had begun to form. For my own part, I found my thoughts returning again and again to the room we had just left. Everything about it had suggested intention. The placement of the violin, the careful progression of the drafts, the repeated refusal of the melody to resolve. It was not abandonment. It was restraint. "Holmes," I said at last, as we turned into a quieter street, "you do not believe Mr. Verne has come to harm?" Holmes shook his head gently. "No, there were no signs of struggle," I continued. "No indication of urgency." "Quite so. And yet," I said, "he has left without word, leaving behind that which appears to have occupied him entirely." Holmes glanced briefly in my direction. "Which suggests," he said, "that his departure was not an interruption, but a continuation." "A continuation of what?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he paused near the edge of the pavement, his gaze lifting slightly, as though tracing an invisible line through the mist, softened air. "Tell me, Watson," he said, "what is required for a melody to be complete?" I considered the question. "A resolution," I said, "a final note or chord that brings the piece to rest, just so. And this melody lacks that resolution." "Yes." Holmes resumed walking. "But consider," he continued, "that resolution need not always be contained within the same space in which the melody begins." I frowned slightly. "You mean it could be finished elsewhere?" Holmes inclined his head. "Precisely." We walked on in silence for a time. The streets of London had grown busier now, though the mist lent everything a softened quality. Figures passed us like quiet shadows, their movements steady, their voices low and indistinct. "And you believe," I said slowly, "that Mr. Verne has gone in search of the place where his melody may be completed?" Holmes gave a faint smile. "Not merely a place, Watson." "Then what?" "A condition." The word lingered. "A condition?" I repeated. "Yes, something required, not of location, but of circumstance." Holmes's gaze drifted briefly toward the passing street, though I could see that he was not truly observing it. "He did not lack the skill to complete the piece," Holmes continued, "nor the time, nor the solitude." "Then what was missing?" I asked. Holmes's voice was very quiet now. "The final note." I could not help but smile faintly. "Holmes, that is precisely what he failed to write." Holmes returned the smile, though his carried a hint of something deeper, or what he chose not to write. We turned once more, this time into a narrower lane, where the sounds of the city faded into a softer background murmur. "Let us consider what we know," Holmes said. "Mr. Verne composes melody. He develops it carefully, refining it through multiple drafts. Yes, he brings it repeatedly to the same point, and no further. Correct. He leaves a version behind in his room. Yes. And sends another to you." Holmes nodded. "Why?" I asked. Holmes slowed his pace slightly. "Because," he said, "the melody is not merely a composition." "Then what is it?" "A question." The simplicity of the answer gave me pause. "A question," I repeated. "Yes, and one that you are meant to answer?" Holmes glanced at me briefly. "Not answer," he said. "Understand." We came to a small square, where a few trees stood bare against the pale sky, their branches reaching upward like quiet lines drawn across the morning. Holmes stopped. "Music," he said, "is, at its essence, a form of expression, but it may also serve as communication." "You believe Mr. Verne is communicating with you?" "I do." "Then why not write a letter?" I asked. "Because," Holmes said softly, "a letter would confine the meaning." I considered this. "Whereas the melody invites interpretation," Holmes finished. A light breeze stirred the mist, shifting it gently across the square. For a moment, the world seemed to blur and soften, as though we stood within the very atmosphere of the mystery itself. "Holmes," I said, "you mentioned earlier that the two versions of the melody end at different points." "Yes. Could that not suggest progression, that he was gradually moving toward completion?" Holmes shook his head. No, the differences are not linear. Then what are they? Holmes turned slightly, his gaze settling upon me with quiet clarity. They are directional. I felt a subtle shift in my understanding. Directional, I repeated. Yes. He drew a small notebook from his pocket and flipped it open, revealing a series of notations. I transcribed the fragment we received, he said, and compared it with the version in the theater. And Holmes turned the notebook toward me. The divergence occurs here. I studied the markings as best I could. It appears subtle, I said. It is, Holmes replied, but significant. In what way? Holmes closed the notebook. One leads inward, he said. The other, outward. I could not help but frown. You speak in abstractions again, Holmes. He smiled faintly. Forgive me. Let me be more precise. He gestured lightly with his hand. The earlier drafts in the room show a tendency toward complexity, layered phrases, intricate progression. Yes, the version sent to us, however, simplifies the structure. It removes certain elements. As though, I began. As though it were being distilled, Holmes said. We stood in silence for a moment. And the purpose of this distillation, I asked. Holmes's gaze lifted once more, though not to anything visible. To make the melody clearer. A distant bell sounded the hour. The air seemed to settle again around us. Holmes, I said, if the melody is a question, and it has been simplified, then perhaps it is meant to be understood more easily. Holmes inclined his head. Just so. And you believe, I continued, that by understanding it, we may discover where Mr. Verne has gone. Holmes's expression softened slightly. I believe, he said, that by understanding it, we may discover why he has gone. We resumed our walk then, turning once more toward Baker Street, and though the city moved around us as it always did, steady, unremarkable, continuous, I could not shake the feeling that we were following something far quieter than footsteps, a pattern, a suggestion, a melody that did not yet end, but which, somewhere beyond our present understanding, awaited its final, inevitable note. By the time we returned to Baker Street, the day had settled into a gentle afternoon stillness. The mist had lifted somewhat, though the light remained soft and diffused, casting a quiet calm over the familiar outlines of the sitting room. Watson had laid out tea, which Holmes acknowledged with a faint nod, though he did not immediately partake. Instead, he moved directly to the table by the window, where the original sheet of music lay waiting. There was, I thought, a curious symmetry in that moment. The fragment had arrived in silence, and now it would be examined in silence. Watson, Holmes said, removing his gloves with deliberate care, if you would be so good as to join me. I set aside my coat and crossed the room. Holmes had already arranged the two versions of the melody, the one sent to us, and his transcription of the version we had seen at the theater, side by side upon the table. Let us consider them not as music, he said, but as structure. I leaned slightly closer. To what end? I asked. To observe what remains when sound is removed. Holmes took up a pencil and began marking lightly upon the margins. You see here, he said, indicating a sequence of notes. This phrase repeats, with variation, in both versions. Yes, I said. And here, this pause, I nodded. It appears in both as well, I observed. Indeed, and yet, its duration differs. I frowned slightly. I had not noticed. Holmes smiled faintly. It is subtle, but essential. He drew a small line beneath the notation. In music, Watson, silence is not absence. It is measure. The idea settled gently in my mind. You mean, I said slowly, that the pauses are as important as the notes themselves. Precisely. Holmes stepped back slightly, folding his arms. Now consider this. If the melody is a question, as we have supposed, then the pauses may represent what? I thought for a moment. Moments of uncertainty? I suggested. Perhaps. Or spaces where something is missing. Holmes inclined his head. Better. He returned to the table and adjusted the sheets once more. Observe the final bars, he said. I did so. In both versions, the melody approached a point that felt, if I may use the term, like a conclusion, and in both, it stopped. But now, with Holmes's guidance, I began to notice something more. The pause at the end, I said. It is longer. Holmes's eyes flickered with quiet approval. Yes, and in the theater version, longer still, just so, a silence followed, but it was not empty. Rather, it seemed filled with the weight of something just beginning to take shape. Holmes, I said, if the pauses are increasing, then the silence itself is growing. He turned slightly toward me. An excellent observation, Watson. But why? I asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he moved toward the window, where the light fell softly across his features. There is a phenomenon, he said quietly, known to those who study both music and perception. I waited. When a sequence is left incomplete, he continued, the mind does not abandon it. It continues inwardly. I felt a subtle shift in my understanding. You mean we completed ourselves? Holmes nodded. Exactly. I glanced once more at the sheets upon the table. And the missing note, I began. Exists, Holmes said softly, but not upon the page. The idea lingered, not written, but perceived. Holmes, I said, if Mr. Fern intended this, then he has created a melody that can only be completed by the listener. Precisely. And the increasing silence draws the listener further inward, Holmes finished. The room seemed quieter now than it had been before, not in a literal sense, but in a way that felt attentive. But why send it to you? I asked again. Holmes turned from the window. Because, he said, I am known to observe what others overlook. And you believe he wishes you to perceive this pattern? I do. Holmes returned to the table and gently gathered the sheets. There's more, he said. He opened his notebook once more, revealing a series of small, carefully drawn symbols. These, he said, represent the intervals between the pauses. I studied them as best I could. They appear uneven, I said. On the surface, yes, and beneath the surface, Holmes closed the notebook softly. They form a progression. I felt a quiet anticipation stir. A progression toward a what? I asked. Holmes's gaze met mine, toward stillness. The words seemed to settle into the room like a final, gentle note. Holmes, I said, you speak as though the silence itself is the destination. He gave a faint, thoughtful smile. Not silence, Watson, he said. Then what? Holmes's voice was very soft now. Listening. We stood there for a time, neither of us speaking. The fire had burned low again, its glow steady but subdued. Outside, the city continued its quiet motion, and within 22 Baker Street, a pattern was forming. At the theater, I said at last, Mr. Calder mentioned that Mr. Verne had grown more withdrawn, that he seemed to be listening, even when no one spoke. Holmes inclined his head. Yes, then perhaps, I continued, he had already begun to follow this progression. Just so. I moved slowly back toward my chair, my thoughts settling into a calmer rhythm. And if the melody leads inward, toward listening, then perhaps Mr. Verne has gone somewhere where such listening is possible. Holmes's eyes rested upon me with quiet approval. A most reasonable conclusion. And where, I asked, might such a place be found? Holmes turned once more toward the window. The light had shifted slightly, softening further as the afternoon wore on. In London, he said, there are many places filled with sound, yes, and few, he continued, defined by its absence. He paused. We must find, he said, a place where silence is not merely present, but essential. The words lingered, and though no answer yet presented itself, I felt, with a growing certainty, that we were drawing nearer, not to a man who had vanished, but to a note that had never been played, and which, perhaps, was never meant to be. Evening returned to London with a quiet grace. The light beyond our windows dimmed gradually, not into darkness, but into a softer shade of gray, one that seemed to blur the edges of the world and invite more reflective kind of thought. Within 22 never Orbibir, the fire had been coaxed once more into a steady glow, and the familiar warmth of the room settled around us like a gentle companion. Holmes had spoken little since our earlier discussion. He sat now in his armchair, the 2 sheets of music resting upon the table beside him, though he did not look at them. His eyes were half closed, not in sleep, but in that peculiar state of inward attention which I had come to recognize as one of his most profound modes of reasoning. I, for my part, had taken up a book, though I cannot claim to have read more than a page or two. My thoughts wandered too easily back to the question that now occupied us, a place where silence was not merely present, but essential. Holmes, I said at last, closing the book gently, you have something in mind. His eyes opened, though only slightly. A possibility, he said, and he turned his head toward the fire, watching the slow movement of the flames. In the course of my inquiries, he began, I have occasionally encountered individuals who seek not sound, but its absence. Monks, perhaps, I suggested. Those who take vows of silence? Holmes inclined his head faintly. An excellent example. But surely, I continued, such places are removed from London, not within it. Not entirely, Holmes replied. He rose then, moving with quiet deliberation toward the mantelpiece. From it, he retrieved a small folded paper, one I had not previously noticed. This arrived, he said, shortly after our return. I frowned slightly. Another message? In the manner of speaking, he handed it to me. It was not, at first glance, remarkable. A simple slip of paper, bearing a short line written in a neat, restrained hand. Where sound is given up, meaning remains. I read it twice. No signature? I asked. None. And you believe this is from the same source? Holmes's expression was calm. I do. I considered the words carefully. Where sound is given up, I repeated. That would seem to support your theory. Yes. Meaning remains, I continued. Then the silence is not emptiness, but something that preserves understanding. Holmes smiled faintly. You see it. I looked up. Holmes, do you know where this place is? He did not answer immediately. Instead, he took the paper back and placed it beside the sheets of music. There is, he said slowly, a small establishment not far from the river. It is seldom spoken of and rarely visited, except by those who seek it deliberately. And what sort of establishment is it? I asked. Holmes turned toward me fully now. A house of quiet. The phrase settled over the room like a soft echo. A retreat, he continued, maintained by a small order. No formal affiliation. No public advertisement. Those who reside there do so temporarily and under a single condition. And that is? Holmes's voice softened. They do not speak. I felt a slight stir of surprise. No speech at all? None. For how long? As long as they remain. The idea, though unusual, did not strike me as implausible. There are, after all, many curious practices in the world, some born of tradition, others of personal necessity. And you believe Mr. Verne may have gone there? I said. Holmes inclined his head. It is consistent with the pattern. I rose from my chair, drawn now by a quiet sense of anticipation. Then we must go at once, I said. Holmes raised a hand gently. Not at once, Watson. I paused. Why not? Holmes turned once more toward the window. Because, he said, to enter such a place unprepared would be to misunderstand it entirely. I considered this. You mean we must also observe a condition? Holmes's eyes met mine, and there was a subtle warmth in his gaze. If we are to find what Mr. Verne sought, he said, we must be willing to approach it as he did. The fire crackled softly. The room seemed to draw inward again, as though echoing the very principle we had been discussing. And when do we go? I asked. Holmes glanced toward the clock. Tomorrow, he said, at first light. A quiet settled over us once more, but now it felt different, not uncertain, not incomplete, but directed. Holmes returned to his chair, though he did not sit immediately. Instead, he paused beside the table, his gaze resting briefly upon the violin. For a moment, I thought he might take it up, but he did not. Instead, he closed the case gently. Holmes, I said, you have not played since last night. He looked at me, and a faint smile touched his lips. No, he said. Why? He considered the question for a moment. Then, very quietly, he replied, Because, Watson, I am listening. The words lingered, and as the evening deepened around us, I found myself becoming aware, not of sound, but of its absence. The quiet between the ticking of the clock, the stillness beneath the crackle of the fire, the space between thoughts. It was not empty, it was present. And somewhere within that presence, I felt, faintly but unmistakably, the shape of the melody we had been following, not heard, but understood. Tomorrow we would seek the place where sound was given up, where meaning remained, and where perhaps the final note of an unfinished melody awaited, not to be played, but to be realized. We set out just before dawn. London, at that early hour, seemed not yet fully awake. The streets lay in a softened hush, the usual rhythm of carts and voices reduced to the occasional distant movement. A pale light stretched slowly across the horizon, not yet gold, but gently silvered, as though the day itself had not decided whether to begin. Holmes walked beside me in silence. It was not the ordinary silence of two men with nothing to say. Rather, it was intentional, observed, even. There was a shared understanding between us now, shaped by all we had uncovered, that to approach this place required something different from our usual manner, something quieter. We followed a path that led us gradually away from the busier streets and toward the river. The air grew cooler, touched faintly with the scent of water and stone. The mist, though lighter than before, still hovered in thin layers along the ground, softening each step. After some time, Holmes slowed. It is near, he said quietly. I nodded. Ahead, partially obscured by a row of trees, stood a modest building. It was neither grand nor neglected, simply present. Its walls were plain, its windows unadorned. There was no sign, no indication of its purpose beyond its stillness. This is it? I asked softly. Holmes inclined his head. Yes. We approached without haste. As we drew nearer, I became aware of something that I had not, at first, noticed. There was no sound. Not merely a lack of voices, but an absence of the small, incidental noises that accompany even the quietest of places. No shifting of feet, no rustle of movement from within. Even the faint murmur of the river seemed distant, as though held at the edge of perception. Holmes paused at the entrance. A simple wooden door stood before us. He turned slightly toward me. "From this point," he said, "we observe their condition." I understood. No speech. Holmes lifted his hand and knocked once, gently. The sound seemed to settle into the air rather than travel through it. We waited. Moments passed. Then, quietly, the door opened. A man stood before us. He was neither old nor young, his features composed and calm. His gaze moved from Holmes to myself, not with suspicion, but with a kind of measured awareness. Holmes inclined his head. The man returned the gesture. No words were exchanged. Instead, the man stepped aside. An invitation. We entered. The door closed behind us with the softness that seemed almost deliberate. The interior of the house was simple, yet carefully ordered. Light entered through high windows, illuminating the space without harshness. The furnishings were minimal: chairs, a long table, a few shelves, each placed with a sense of quiet purpose, and throughout it all, stillness. A few others were present. They moved slowly, deliberately, each action carried out without haste. One man sat near the window, his hands folded loosely before him. A woman arranged a set of cups upon a table with careful precision. Another figure stood near the far wall, gazing outward, unmoving. None spoke. None needed to. Holmes stood beside me, his posture relaxed, yet attentive. I could sense, even without words, that he was observing everything: the arrangement of the room, the rhythm of movement, the quality of the silence itself. It was not empty, it was structured. The man who had admitted us gestured gently toward a pair of chairs. Holmes nodded and took a seat. I followed. No instruction was given, none was required. Time passed. I cannot say how long. In that place, time did not move in the way I was accustomed to measuring it. There were no clocks visible, no markers of progression. Only the gradual shift of light, the subtle change in posture, the quiet continuation of presence. At first, I found my thoughts restless. Accustomed as I was to conversation, to the exchange of ideas, I felt the absence of speech as something to be filled. Questions formed, unspoken, and lingered without resolution. But gradually, something shifted. The need to speak lessened. The urge to define, to categorize, to conclude, softened. In its place, there arose a different kind of awareness, one that did not seek to answer, but to observe. I became aware of the faint sound of breath, my own and that of those around me, the subtle movement of light across the floor, the quiet presence of Holmes beside me, still and composed, and beneath it all, a sense of something familiar, the melody, not heard, but present. I turned slightly, almost instinctively, and my gaze came to rest upon a figure seated at the far end of the room. He sat apart, though not isolated. Before him upon a small stand rested a violin. Mr. Elias Verne. There was no mistaking him. Though I had not seen him before, there was something in his bearing, something in the stillness with which he held himself, that matched precisely the impression we had formed. He was not absent. He was listening. Holmes's gaze followed mine. He saw him as well. But he did not move, nor did I. Verne remained seated, his hands resting lightly upon his knees, his eyes lowered, not closed, but softened, as though directed inward rather than outward. The violin lay before him, untouched. We watched, not with urgency, but with quiet attention. At length, though I could not say how long, Verne's hand moved. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for the violin. There was no tension in the moment, no sense of anticipation as one might feel before a performance, only continuation. He lifted the instrument, set it gently beneath his chin, raised the bow, and then he began to play. The first notes were familiar, the same gentle unfolding we had heard before, measured, calm, unhurried. The melody moved forward, through the phrases we knew, through the pauses we had come to recognize, and then past them, further than before. I felt something within me shift, not surprise, but recognition. He continued. The notes neither rushed nor lingered. They simply followed, and then, at last, he reached the place where before the melody had always ceased. The silence that followed was deeper than any we had yet known. Then that silence, he placed a single note. It was soft, so soft that it seemed less like sound and more like its memory. Yet it completed everything. The melody did not end. It resolved. The final note lingered, not in the air, but within. Vern lowered the bow. The violin rested once more. No one moved. No one spoke. Holmes remained still beside me, and though he said nothing, I knew, with a quiet certainty, that he had understood. The melody had never been unfinished. It had only been waiting for the place where it could be heard, not aloud, but fully. And in that moment, within the stillness of that quiet house, I felt something settle, not just within the music, but within myself. The final note had been found, not written, not played, but realized. We did not leave at once. To depart immediately after what we had witnessed would have felt abrupt, as though one had risen from a chair before fully settling into it. Instead, we remained seated, allowing the moment to soften, to unfold into something quieter still. Mr. Elias Verne had lowered his instrument. The violin now rested once more upon the stand before him, exactly as we had seen it in the theater, yet somehow altered, not in position, but in presence. It no longer seemed like an object awaiting completion. It had become sufficient. Holmes did not move. His gaze remained directed toward Verne, though there was no intensity in it, no pursuit, no question waiting to be asked, only a calm, steady attention. I, too, found myself watching, not with curiosity as before, but with a kind of understanding that did not require words. Time passed. How long? I cannot say. In that place, duration had little meaning. There was only the quiet continuity of being. At length, Verne lifted his head. His eyes opened fully, not abruptly, but as one might return from a deep and restful thought. He did not look about the room at once. Instead, his gaze rested gently upon the space before him, as though acknowledging something that had already been seen. Then, slowly, he turned. His eyes met Holmes's. No greeting was exchanged, no introduction offered, yet something passed between them, something clear and complete, recognition. Holmes inclined his head, just slightly. Verne returned the gesture. There are moments, Watson, which do not require speech, not because words are insufficient, but because they would add nothing to what is already understood. This was such a moment. After a time, Verne arose. His movements were unhurried, composed. He placed the violin carefully within its case, closing it with a soft, deliberate motion. Then, without looking back, he moved toward the far side of the room. A door stood there, one I had not previously noticed. He passed through it and was gone. I turned to Holmes. For a moment, I considered speaking, asking the questions that had formed so readily in my mind upon our arrival. Why had he left? Why the unfinished melody? Why send it to Holmes? But the questions felt distant now, not unanswered, but unnecessary. Holmes rose. He did so quietly, as one might rise from a place of rest rather than from inquiry. He turned slightly toward me. There was a faint expression upon his face, one I had seldom seen, not satisfaction, not triumph, but something gentler, understanding. We made our way toward the door. The man who had admitted us earlier stood nearby. He inclined his head as we approached. Holmes returned the gesture. Still no words were spoken. The door opened. We stepped outside. The air had changed. The mist had lifted entirely now, replaced by a soft, clear light that marked the full arrival of morning. The sounds of London had returned, not abruptly, but gradually. Distant footsteps, the low murmur of voices, the gentle roll of wheels along stone, and yet something for remained. We walked for some distance before either of us spoke. At last, I turned to Holmes. "Well?" I said softly. Holmes did not answer at once. He continued walking, his gaze directed ahead, his hands once more clasped behind his back. "The melody," I said, "was complete." "Yes," Holmes replied. "And yet there was no final flourish, no grand conclusion. No, only a single note." Holmes inclined his head. I considered this. "And that was enough?" I asked. Holmes turned slightly toward me. "It was," he said. We walked on. "Holmes," I said after a time, "when you first received the fragment, you believed it to be incomplete." "I did." "And now?" Holmes's expression softened slightly. "Now," he said, "I see that it was never incomplete. I felt a quiet sense of clarity begin to form. It required the right condition," I said. "Precisely." "And that condition was not something that could be written or played, but only experienced," Holmes finished. The city moved gently around us. "And Mr. Verne?" I asked. "He has not disappeared at all." Holmes gave a faint smile. "No, he simply removed himself from noise." "Yes." I nodded slowly. "And the message he sent you?" Holmes reached into his pocket, withdrew the small slip of paper once more. "Where sound is given up, meaning remains." "He wished to be understood," Holmes said. "And you have understood him." Holmes folded the paper carefully. "Yes." We walked on in silence for a while longer, but it was no longer the same silence we had known before. It was not expectant, not searching. It was complete. "Holmes," I said at last, "there is one thing I do not yet understand." He glanced at me. "Yes." "Why you?" I said. "Why send the melody to you at all?" Holmes was quiet for a moment. Then, with the faintest trace of a smile, he replied, "Because, my dear Watson, I am known to listen." The answer, simple as it was, seemed entirely sufficient. We turned then toward Acre Street. And as we did, I found myself becoming aware, not of the noise of the city, nor even of its quiet, but of something beneath both, a kind of stillness that did not depend upon circumstance, a stillness that remained, and in that stillness I could almost hear it again, not the melody itself, but the space in which it had been completed, a single note, soft, unassuming, yet entirely enough. And I understood then that what we had witnessed was not the solving of a mystery in the usual sense. There had been no culprit, no crime, no pursuit, only a question, and the quiet realization of its answer, not spoken, but known. We returned to Baker Street in the late morning. The city had fully awakened by then, its usual rhythms restored, carriages passing in steady intervals, voices carried along the pavement, the distant chime of bells marking the hour. And yet, as we climbed the familiar steps to 221B, I could not help but feel that something within me had shifted, not dramatically, not in any way that could be easily named, but subtly, as though a space I had not previously noticed had been gently filled. Mrs. Hudson greeted us with her usual warmth, though she paused, perhaps sensing something different in our demeanor. "You have had a quiet morning, gentlemen," she said. Holmes inclined his head. "A most instructive one, Mrs. Hudson." She smiled, though she did not inquire further. We entered the sitting room. Everything was as we had left it. The chairs, the table, the violin case resting near the window, the small, familiar details of our shared life, unchanged, and yet not quite the same. Holmes removed his coat and set it aside, then crossed the room without hesitation. He paused beside the table, where the sheet of music still lay. For a moment, he simply looked at it. Then, with a gentle motion, he lifted it. "Watson," he said, "would you care to hear it once more?" I smiled faintly. "I would." Holmes opened his violin case. The instrument caught the light, just as it had before, warm, polished, quietly waiting. He raised it into position. The first note soft, familiar. He played the melody as we had heard it before, measured, unhurried, allowing each phrase to unfold naturally into the next. I listened, not with the expectation of completion, but with a quiet awareness of what would come. The melody moved forward, through the passages we knew, through the pauses we had come to understand. And then it approached that place, the point where, before, it had always ceased. Holmes did not stop. He allowed the silence to enter, not as interruption, but as part of the whole. And then, gently, he placed the final note. It was the same, soft, unassuming, yet entirely complete. The sound faded, but something remained. Holmes lowered the violin. He did not speak, nor did I. There was no need. After a moment he returned the instrument to its case, closing it with quiet care, and he folded the sheet of music once more and placed it neatly within a drawer of his desk. Not discarded, not forgotten, but set aside. "Well," I said at last, my voice softer than I had intended, "that concludes the matter." Holmes glanced at me, and a faint smile touched his lips. "Does it?" he asked. I considered this. "In the practical sense, yes," I said. "There is no mystery remaining, no culprit," Holmes added. "No crime, no pursuit." Holmes moved to his chair and sat. "Then perhaps," he said, "it was never that sort of case." I took my seat opposite him. "No," I said slowly, "I suppose it was not." The fire burned quietly. Outside, the city continued its steady motion. "Holmes," I said, "do you think we shall hear from Mr. Verne again?" Holmes leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting toward the window. "I do not know," he said. "And if we do not?" Holmes was silent for a moment. Then, very quietly, he replied, "Then we shall have already heard what he wished to say." The answer, simple as it was, felt complete. I reached for my journal, not with the urgency of recording a case for publication, but with a quieter intention, to remember. As I began to write, I found that the words came more slowly than usual, not because there was less to say, but because what had been experienced did not lend itself easily to description. How does one describe a silence that is not empty, a melody that is not unfinished, a resolution that does not declare itself, yet leaves nothing undone? I paused. Holmes across from me had closed his eyes once more, not in sleep, but in that same quiet state of listening. The room was still, and in that stillness I understood something I had not fully grasped before, that not all mysteries are meant to be solved in the manner of deduction. Some are meant to be heard, not with the ears, but with attention. I closed the journal. There would be time enough to write. For now, It was enough to sit. The fire gave a soft, steady glow. The light beyond the window shifted gently as the day moved forward, and within 2012 Baker Street, a quiet remained, not imposed, not required, but simply present. Holmes opened his eyes. He glanced toward me. There was a brief moment, no more than a second, in which something passed between us. Not a question, not an answer, an understanding. He inclined his head slightly. I returned the gesture, and so the matter rested, not concluded in the usual sense, but complete, the case of the silent violin, not solved, but listened to, and in that listening, resolved.